You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health Podcast. My guest today is Audrey Gaskins. She's an assistant professor at Emory University in the Rollins School of Public Health. And we're going to be talking about everything related to semen quality in men, what's happening to it, why it's important, etc. So, Audrey, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is it's an unusual topic. What caused you to be interested in this area in the first place?
Sure. So a combination of things. First and foremost, there have been a couple papers that have come out in the past 10 years that have been somewhat alarming, showing that male semen quality worldwide seems to be on the decline. And this is something that we've seen in most developed countries across the U.S. And so there's been a lot of speculation about what factors might be driving this decline in sperm counts, a big one being lifestyle and environmental exposures. On top of that, most of my work is focused on fertility, which has historically mostly focused on the female exposure and really female endpoints, although it's a couple-based endpoint. And so, I've been curious to study men because they've just been historically understudied. And even though they contribute, let's say, 50% to the equation. And so it was really those two main drivers that got me interested in studying how diet and the environment affect male fertility.
Yeah, when you say semen quality, what does that mean? Is it just the number of sperm? Is it the morphology? The number that are viable? I mean, what factors go into that statement, semen quality?
All of the above. So the kind of standard semen analysis would consist of sperm concentration, which is the number of sperm per milliliter of ejaculate. Sperm motility, so the percentage of sperm in the sample that is moving in an upwards or a motile fashion. Morphology, so the percent of sperm in the sample that have a normal head, a normal tail, kind of all features about it look normal. And then, other ones that we assess are things like total volume, so the actual amount. And then from there, those can be used in combination to get an idea of kind of total sperm count, total normal sperm count, total motile sperm count, all of those different permutations. So that's kind of the standard semen quality analysis, although now methods are being developed to look at things like DNA fragmentation in sperm, epigenetics in sperm, and other kind of more targeted markers.
So when people say sperm quality is going down, what's going down? What's decreasing? What's worsening?
Right. It's primarily sperm concentration. So again, when I was saying before, the number of sperm per milliliter of ejaculate, that's the primary endpoint that seems to be decreasing.
Well, what was it before on average and what is it now and over what time period?
Right. So if I'm remembering correctly from the study, the most recent study that was published in Human Reproduction, I think 2 years ago, they saw about a 52% decrease in sperm concentrations over the past 50 years. And I can't remember the exact kind of average sperm counts that they started and stopped on, but it's a pretty big decline.
What's the threshold below which people are considered infertile, or it's much harder to conceive?
Yep. So the WHO, their cutoff to define low sperm concentration is 15 million sperm per milliliter. And in studies that have looked at how semen quality and sperm concentration relate to spontaneous fertility or time to pregnancy, they've shown that sperm counts below, or sperm concentrations below 20 million sperm per milliliter, that's really the cutoff where you start to see effects on natural or kind of spontaneous fertility.
And the people, so the studies that are looking at sperm counts going down, I guess they would have to control for age, or what kind of factors do they control for? What modulates sperm production in a man's life? Does it, go down significantly with age? I mean, what seems to modulate it?
Yeah, so age is a big one. They've also tried to control for things like body weight, which we know can impact sperm quantity and quality. And, as on average, Americans and most populations worldwide have gotten heavier. They've also tried to control for this factor as well. I think for a little while, people were concerned that, the technologies that we're using to measure semen quality have changed over time. And so could that be potentially driving it? But as more and more studies have come out that have really, tried to and done a really good job of controlling for these factors, we've really seen that it seems to be something else. Like it can't be explained by all of these factors are one in isolation.
So, what are you trying to figure out? Just what are the factors, and why is it happening? Like, are you in a subset of this problem, or are you just looking at the problem as a whole? And what's your method or your approach to figuring it out?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm an epidemiologist, meaning that I study large populations of humans and how their exposures affect their disease states. And so when we study male fertility, usually we're studying a population of men anywhere from 100 to 500 to a couple thousand. And we ask them about their diet and their lifestyle choices. We can measure body weight and height and other metrics, other anthropometrics on them. And then for environmental chemicals, a lot of times we will take a urine sample where we will assess their exposure to things like phthalates or BPA or other endocrine disrupting chemicals. And then we'll relate those to their semen quality parameters. And so my research has really been kind of in all of those different areas, just trying to see, for example, like with the endocrine disrupting chemicals, a lot of them are hypothesized to mimic estrogen in the body. And so, one of the primary hypotheses linking these is that, the men with higher exposure to the endocrine disrupting chemicals will have higher levels of estrogen in the body, and this might be negatively affecting spermatogenesis. And, exposure to endocrine disrupting chemicals is in theory something that we can have control over, either through policies or kind of limiting their production. And so trying to understand like what these harmful chemicals might be so that we can, halt this decline, or we can, counsel men on, avoiding these chemicals, are all important research questions.
So how does a man's sperm count change with age in general?
Sure. So on average, it goes down as a man ages, but it's pretty variable. You still hear reports in the news of men who are in their 70s who are spawning offspring. And so, in some men, even when they're older, they still produce enough semen to produce a child. But on average, it tends to go down with time.
Well, have we compared curves of that from years ago versus curves now? Like, has the slope or nature of the curve changed? Perhaps that reveals something. And does much happen in the, let's say, 18 to 30-year-old range?
So most of the studies on semen quality have been cross-sectional, meaning that we just look at exposure and outcome at one point in time. And so we don't really have these longitudinal studies necessarily where we follow men over time and we take multiple semen samples to look at kind of rate of decline within a man. We're usually kind of comparing across men, if that makes sense. And so, a lot of the questions I think you're asking are really relevant, but we don't have the data yet to kind of directly answer your question.
Well, if the average age of the person, if you blend everyone together and, it skews towards a 35-year-old, they may have a much heavier body burden of chemicals because they've just been around longer than a 20-year-old.
I see what you mean.
Maybe that is skewing things. I don't know.
Yeah, possibly. So, most of the endocrine disrupting chemicals that I focus on are metabolized very quickly. And so, there's something like when we would measure a metabolite in urine, it generally reflects exposure in the past 24 to 36 hours. There are chemicals that kind of, as you mentioned, that kind of do get stored in the adipose tissue and are more kind of long-lasting exposures, which you might hypothesize would kind of accumulate and maybe have a stronger effect among older men. But, even so, age is one of the easiest variables to control for. And so in all of the studies that have kind of looked at sperm decline and have also looked at, various lifestyle and environmental exposures, they've virtually all controlled for age. That's something that we can get good information on.
What about frequency of sex with their partner? And, does it vary by ethnicity? Does it vary actually by if the person's hetero or homosexual? I wonder if any of these would have a factor.
Yeah, so when we do studies and collect a semen sample, we advise participants to abstain for a set amount of time. So we try and kind of control for this factor by design. And then when the men come into the clinic, we ask them to self-report the number of days or hours since their last ejaculation. Because like you said, it is an important determinant of the outcome. But oftentimes it's not associated with the exposure. So it's not what we call kind of a true confounder of the relationship, but we do always make sure to collect information on this variable because as you mentioned, it can be an important determinant of semen quality.
Yeah, I just wonder if, let's say a couple's trying to conceive and then they're having sex regularly with the intent to conceive, if that, just has a big effect on the amount of sperm that the man produces. Let's say they're having sex like every third day. Does it cause the man to recruit a lot more sperm than they otherwise would in a condition where they're not doing that?
Yeah. No, I don't think we have any studies that suggest that per se. And, again, I'll kind of point to what I said at the beginning where even men with low sperm count have 15 million sperm per milliliter of ejaculate, and the average ejaculate is anywhere from around 3 milliliters. So that's still a lot of sperm. And it just takes one, healthy sperm to produce an embryo in a pregnancy. So we're still talking about a lot of sperm, even when we talk about low sperm counts.
Okay. But yet, if 15 is the lower limit, let's say it's, about 45 million sperm are necessary. So it's kind of odd to think of it that way. Like, why are so many necessary to make this happen when it only takes one? But, and that's another question. So. Yeah, no,
it's a good point. And I think, that's something that a lot of researchers are interested in as well as kind of, like how is the best sperm selected? And, there's a lot of interest in figuring that out.
So what chemicals are you focused on and what's the mechanism or the proposed mechanism of action where they're affecting the man?
Yeah, so my research on the environment mostly focuses on 1, air pollution exposure, and 2, endocrine disrupting chemicals. So as I mentioned, for the endocrine disrupting chemicals, the primary hypothesis is that they mimic hormones in the body because they have a similar structure. We're primarily interested in ones that mimic estrogen because, like I said, if it's mimicking estrogen, in theory, there'll be higher levels in the body, and this could negatively impact spermatogenesis, But there's also chemicals that they think might be anti-estrogenic or might mimic testosterone or, all of the above. And so that's why a lot of interest has been placed into endocrine disrupting chemicals in the area of reproductive health, just because it's such a hormonally dependent outcome. Air pollution, it does contain some endocrine disrupting chemicals that we breathe in through the air. And so that's one mechanism of possible action, but we also know that air pollution affects things like, inflammation and oxidative stress in the body. It can also, affect DNA methylation when we talk about like epigenetics. And so there are a lot of potential pathways that we think the air that we breathe might be negatively affecting reproductive health as well.
All right. So that's your focus, is exposure to air pollution?
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
So I guess it'll be interesting if you looked at people that are living in a given area for a time, or people that come into that area, and what happens to their sperm, when they first enter, and then when they've been there for, a month or 6 months or a year. Mm-hmm. But again, just more factors.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I think there are some interesting kind of natural experiments that you could look at when it comes to air pollution. So, with the forest fires that happen out west, that have been more common these past couple of years. In theory, if you were able to collect multiple semen samples from men during these timeframes, you could look to see, like within a man, if those short-term changes in air pollution affect sperm quality.
And how would you look at air pollution if their diets can be different, if, their work environments are different, how do you anecdotally figure out, let's say by interviewing someone, or, you can't lock them in a lab. Mm-hmm. So how do you figure out what these guys are exposed to that could confound the results?
Yeah, so the main way we assess exposure to air pollution is based on their residential address. And so we take their residential address, we geocode it, and then we can link that to these validated spatiotemporal models of different air pollutants. And so what these models basically do is they say, based on the weather conditions and the point sources of air pollution that are around you, so things like industrial sources or roadways, they can predict what the exposure to PM 2.5 or ozone or nitrogen dioxide might be at that person's residence for every day that we're possibly interested in. So for spermatogenesis, this typically takes about 72 days to 90 days, so about 3 months. And so we would look at kind of a man's average exposure to air pollution in the 3 months prior to their sperm sample or semen sample. And then we make the assumption that the ambient air at their residence is a pretty good reflection of their kind of what they're inhaling. And, with the caveat of most people do not spend all of their time at home. And there are important limitations of using this type of assessment to get at personal exposure. But again, on average, it does a pretty good job of saying, this is the amount of air pollution you're exposed to. There are other kind of more, there are ways to assess personal exposure to air pollution that require men to carry around personal monitors. But it's more challenging to recruit people. The personal monitors are not perfect. So there's pros and cons of each method.
I would think season would have a big effect on sperm count. It sounds like, I guess there needs to be a lot known about how sperm count varies, I'm just picturing different ethnicities of people, and then the winter, the air pollution is dramatically different from the summer. And I don't know, it seems like you have a tough job figuring this out. What do you do to control for stuff?
Right. And so that's why when we do studies, we really try and collect information on all aspects of the person's life. So season, there is some seasonal variability in semen quality, which we aren't entirely sure what's driving this. Maybe it's pollution, maybe it's vitamin D from the sun, maybe it's temperature, maybe it's climate. We don't really know. It really depends on the area, how much air pollution varies by season, kind of where in the country or the world we're talking, where, some places there are huge differences by season, other places there isn't. So again, one way that we can also really help to try and build the evidence is by looking in different populations. And if we still see the same association across the world, in different states, in different groups of men, then that really helps strengthen the argument that this is real. There seems to be something going on because we see it across all of these different populations where there are probably a lot of different factors affecting the results.
Well, how far along are you in the studies? What have you seen so far? Any trends or interesting data?
Yeah, one thing that we found pretty consistently is that men who consume a healthier diet have healthier sperm. And this seems very simple, but, was somewhat novel when it came out. So in general, men who ate more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, fish, and less processed foods, and red meat and starchy vegetables, those men just had a higher sperm counts and better quality sperm. So that was one of the first findings. And again, we saw this in both subfertile men and also in a young, healthy population of young men. We also saw in two separate cohorts that men who engaged in more physical activity had significantly better or higher sperm concentrations. And so, again, suggesting that maintaining an active lifestyle is important for male fertility. In terms of environmental chemicals, we've seen that phthalates, which is a type of endocrine disrupting chemical, negatively affects sperm concentrations. And phthalates are something that are found in everything from personal care products to food manufacturing devices, to the coating of some pharmaceutical drugs. It's really kind of all over the place.
So you're getting semen samples from the men, but are you looking at their testosterone and their estrogen as you're doing it?
Yeah, a lot of times we do try and collect a blood sample as well so we can measure reproductive hormones. It just depends on what we have available in the given study.
Well, any correlation between low sperm counts and low testosterone or high estrogen or some kind of mix?
Yeah, exactly. So usually men with higher testosterone levels tend to have higher sperm counts. When we've been able to look at reproductive hormones, we actually haven't seen, when we see an effect on sperm concentration, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll see an effect on any specific hormone. And so, so they don't always kind of go together, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, that's what I was wondering. What about sex drive? Does that have any relation to, the ability to give a sample at all? It would be tough if it was very low. But any correlation there?
So in another one of our studies, we are starting to look at, they have standardized questionnaires that get at sex drive and erectile function. And so we're starting to look at this endpoint as well as kind of, something beyond semen quality that could have important implications for male fertility. And but this is a really new endpoint that we're just now focusing on. So we're excited to kind of see if some lifestyle environmental exposures also affect this endpoint as well. Because, as you mentioned, that's an important factor.
Yeah, because if a couple's trying to conceive, but the man's sex drive is low, it doesn't matter if he has the most amazing sperm in the world.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be harder for anything to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's becoming more recognized that, erectile dysfunction is not a disorder that is limited to older men, outside of reproductive age. It's more common than we thought among young men. And so trying to figure out what are the main risk factors for that, and, potential treatments as well.
So what would be a happy result, over the next few years for you to figure out?
I think one thing, kind of looking forward and really focusing on kind of what patients want to know, is that so far we've mainly done observational research. So we've just said, when we're studying diet, for example, we ask people what they eat, they provide us a semen sample, and we look at the correlation or the association between the two. But one thing I think that we're really interested in kind of moving this forward is like, okay, so if we were to randomly assign men to eat a healthy diet or to take a specific nutritional supplement, will this actually improve their sperm counts? And then, one step forward, will this actually improve the couple's chances of getting pregnant? And, so far we haven't really been able to answer that question just because of the type of studies we've been doing. So I think, that's really the way that most people in my field are hoping things will go to really help build the evidence for couples and for men who are, potentially struggling from low sperm counts or difficulty getting pregnant.
Well, if it's, pollution does have a role, I mean, what do? You tell the person, like, go to the country for a month or, move?
Yeah, I mean, there are things you can do to reduce your personal exposure. Like I mentioned, a big component of your personal exposure is where you live and where you work. So trying to as much as you're able, trying to avoid places near a major highway or another major industrial emitter of pollution. If that's outside your control, you can also try and limit your time outdoors during, more heavily polluted times. So during rush hour or on days when air pollution levels are really high, your indoor filtration system, HVAC unit, that can be an important modifier of, how much of the outdoor air pollution gets to your indoors. So there are things you can do on a personal level, but policy is majorly important, and making sure that we elect people that are protecting our environmental health is really important.
And any variation across the world in various countries that you've seen
in terms of semen quality?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so most of the work has focused on the U.S. and even more broadly developed countries, and so it's hard to make strong conclusions comparing to other countries just because there isn't a ton of data yet. But as I mentioned, most of the decline that we've seen in sperm counts has really been isolated to Western countries like the United States and Europe. And so, hopefully now that it's becoming a research topic of more interest to epidemiologists and clinicians is, hopefully we'll get more data and we'll be able to look in more understudied areas such as developing countries. Okay,
very good. So what's the best way for people to find out more, maybe read papers that you've authored and, get in contact with or find out more about your research?
Sure. So you can follow me on Twitter. I try and tweet about our research when it comes out. And I also promote other colleagues' research in the field that I think is interesting and that I'm reading. My Twitter is Audrey Jane 4. You can also, the other way that you can kind of keep abreast of this type of research is by setting a Google alert or going on PubMed, which is kind of our academic search engine, and just searching for, diet and semen quality or environment and semen quality. And all of the papers or all of the science that is funded by the National Institute of Health, which is the majority of my research, should be publicly available to U.S. citizens.
Well, that's great. Well, Audrey, thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Sure. It was great to be here.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts, You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.